Hi everyone, this is Robert and welcome to IDG Live. This is a pre-recorded live stream, so I should say up front, if you are watching this as live over on YouTube, then I won't be there to answer your comments and questions live. May be able to pop into the chat just to say hi, but I've got a whole load of questions from my patrons, and that's what I'll be working through today. And today we are looking at Saruman. We've been doing a sort of a slow series of working through some of the major characters in the Lord of the Rings. And today we get to Saruman. Now, let's start, before I get onto my questions, let's start with just sort of a brief overview of who he is and his history. We obviously know the last bit in The Lord of the Rings, but what has led up to this? Well, Saruman is a Maya. And what that means is he's one of these kind of angelic, immortal beings, which was created by Eru, Ilúvatar, the one true god of Tolkien's world, way back before the beginning of time. And he was there for the music of the Ainur, which is the singing into existence. It's a bit more complicated than this, but it's the singing into existence of everything. And after that, Eru said, right, I've now made this world, I've made the universe. Who wants to go down there and help guide and govern it? And some of the Ainur did. One of those was the being we know as Saruman. Now, he, therefore, being in the world now, he is immortal, so he cannot be killed, but he's a spiritual being who can take on physical shapes and forms. So when we think of Saruman and we think of this figure, Christopher Lee behind me, yes, that is him, but he could also take on other forms, not in that particular moment in time, because at that particular moment in time, as we'll get onto, he was kind of like bound into that body. But for a huge period of time, he was there with the Valar, the higher angelic beings, the sort of the godly pantheon, as it were, of this world. And he was attached to one of those Valar in particular, a guy called Aula the Smith. He was the Valar who was associated most with crafting, with making things. And Saruman was sort of his disciple, really. He learned from him. And you should probably say, first up, he wasn't called Saruman back then. The name that he actually had and went by most of the time was Kurumo, which means skillful one. Now, when we get on to Saruman, which is the name that he was given by the people in Middle-earth, that also means the same kind of thing, man of skill. So it's the same name, but translated into different languages. Now, the first proper mention we have of him is as being one of the five guardians. Now, these were way back in the mists of time. The Valar had been told by Eru to await the children, the awakening of the children of Ilúvatar. These were elves and humans. They didn't know where, they didn't know when, but they knew they were going to come. And the elves did awaken, and they awakened into a world, Middle-earth, by a lakeside, where that continent at the time was being controlled by Morgoth. The Valar had sort of retreated away onto another continent, really. But eventually they did discover them. Orome, the hunter, stumbled across them, and it's like, whoa, they're here. What do we do? So he heads back to the Valar, and they have a big discussion about what to do. But they think the first thing they need to do is make sure the elves are protected. So, and this is all relatively, there were hints of this before in The Lord of the Rings and elsewhere, but this is all relatively new. We hear about it in The Nature of Middle-earth, which is a collection of Tolkien's writings that hadn't previously been put into publication. They sent 5 Maiar to the elves just to watch over them. Now, these are led by another, so there were 6, really. Melian, the Maya, was the leader, and the 5. The 5 are, the writing is a little bit uncertain. We get this with a lot of Tolkien's works is that if it's not been published, he was the kind of writer who would just like scribble things on the back of envelopes or cross something out or rub it out and write something new in there. That's what we're dealing with when we're working out these wider writings. And so sometimes we're not 100% certain whether he intended this in his final creation, whether this was just a working draft, because he obviously didn't put notes on everything as to whether he still believed it, but this seems to fit in with what we know from elsewhere. So these 5-6 Maiar guarded the elves, and they got invited. The elves got invited to rather forcefully, it has to be said. It wasn't just a hey, do you want to come over? It was a strong suggestion from the Valar that they should all go over to the Undying Lands with them, which kind of made sense in a way. The elves were also immortal beings tied into Arda, this new world, and they got invited over. Now, the five guardians, including Saruman, were there protecting them during this time. And then Saruman disappears back to do whatever he was doing before, presumably crafting things with Aula. Until we get to the Third Age of Middle-earth. And we're now in the build-up to the main story that we know. The Valar are starting to get concerned about Sauron's return. Sauron had, after the end of the Second Age, which is the bit that we see in the prologue to the first Fellowship of the Ring, the first Lord of the Rings film, the Fellowship of the Ring, when the ring gets cut from Sauron's finger and we get Isildur and all of that kind of stuff. After that, Sauron just kind of, he disappears from public life. He's a spirit without a body. And he's gone for the first 1,000 years or so of the Third Age. But then eventually he does come back in secret. And the Valar can kind of sense this. And they're trying to work out how do they help out the free peoples of Middle-earth, who are, we should probably just point out, weaker than they have been at any other point in history. The elves have been slowly heading back over to the Blessed Realm, or going there for the first time. They're feeling the call to go west. Humans were incredibly mighty as the Númenóreans, but the lore, the knowledge, the civilization they had, that's starting to be forgotten by this point. The dwarves have largely been locking themselves up in places like Khazad-dûm and keeping themselves out of and away from contact with lots of other people. So the free peoples are not that strong at the moment, and the Valar think, well, how do we help them out? So they don't want to go over and intervene themselves, but they think they can send some help. So they think back and they're, well, we sent these 5 guys before. Let's send some people back again. And they ask for volunteers amongst the Maiar. The idea is that Sauron is a Maiar, so they'll send some other people of sort of the rough same kind of order of strength. Sauron is more strong, but they're in the same kind of order. Saruman puts up his hand straight away, says, yeah, I'll go. And then the 4 others get chosen. And we start at this point, though, to get a little bit of a sense of this idea that Saruman, although he's not going to sort of properly turn evil till later, he's a bit proud. He's a bit grumpy. And he's quite full of himself. And he doesn't like the fact that although he was put up his hand, he was chosen, he was the first and made basically the leader of this. First of all, when Gandalf goes and is picked, Gandalf didn't want to go. Gandalf didn't think he was up to it, but he gets forced into it by Manwë and then gets sort of told, you're the third of these number, and then Barad just comes in and says, not the third. And Saruman's like, what are you saying? Actually, he's like my level? I don't like that. Then he gets told that he has to go with Radagast, and clearly he thinks Radagast is beneath him, and he kind of moans and grumbles about it. I don't want to go with him. So we immediately get this idea that he's not very happy, and he's quite full of himself and the level that he thinks he's at compared to everyone else. But they head off and get to Middle-earth, and he pretty soon after that, heads off to the east, to the part of the map of Middle-earth we simply don't know huge amounts about. And we simply do not know much of what he did for most of that time. But he did slowly move back towards the west over time. And when I say slowly, he came for the founding of the White Council. The White Council being the gathering of the wise. Now, we don't know the full membership list of the White Council, but it definitely had Saruman, it definitely had Gandalf, definitely had Elrond, definitely had Galadriel, a few others around there, definitely Círdan was counted among the wise. Glorfindel, I'm sure if he was there, would be very welcome. So we don't have a full cast list, but definitely those four were there. And the first thing they had to do in this meeting was decide who's in charge. And Saruman just kind of assumed he would be. But Galadriel wanted Gandalf. And this kind of annoyed Saruman. It should be me. I'm the leader of the Order. But Gandalf's there going, no, I don't actually want to be leader. I don't want to be tied down anywhere. This isn't me. I'm just going around, wandering around, Grey Pilgrim, you know the deal. And so he says no, and then Saruman becomes leader. But he's a little bit annoyed about this. And he also discovers that when they'd arrived, Círdan had given the Ring of Power to Gandalf, the Ring of Fire to Gandalf, not to him. Again, he's feeling quite snubbed. So we're getting all of these kind of snapshots that Sauron is not this great and wonderful guy, even from the very beginning. Yes, he was good. Yes, he had not fallen to evil properly and wouldn't do for a long, long time. But already we're just getting these little droplets that perhaps not all is well. But then he kind of returns around this kind of time that Sauron. So Sauron has come back from a period of what's called the Watchful Peace. He basically, Gandalf had chased him out of Mirkwood, and for a few hundred years he was away in the east before he returns at around the time that the ring is found by Gollum. And at around the time Saruman also returns. So these things are all connected. It's almost as if the powers that be in the world can sense things are starting to move. And eventually, Saruman spends a reasonable amount of that kind of next period of time in Minas Tirith, actually. He spends a lot of time researching, learning about rings of power. This was his specialist topic, but also probably discovering that in Orthanc was one of these Palantiri, the legendary, incredibly powerful seeing stones. And he thought, yeah, I quite like that. And in the year 2759, he gets given the keys to Orthanc. He basically promises that he would be there and protect Rohan's western border. Now, the historical context for this, if you saw, when was it, last year maybe, the War of the Rohirrim animated film, not many people did, actually, which is a shame. I thought it was all right. It was not 100% lore accurate, not the best thing ever made, but it was all right. That's the historical context, in that there was this very, very bad winter. And during this period, the Dunlendings had attacked Rohan and caused huge amounts of damage. And Helm Hammerhand, that's when the legend of Helm Hammerhand is set, he dies. They have to kind of reset, go to a new line of kings. Frealaf is the king. And that's the point when they're very weak, that Saruman is there saying, well, I could protect you. I could stay here at Isengard, and I could make sure nobody comes in on your western flank again. It sounds like a very good offer, because he's not there apparently wanting to set up an empire or anything of his own. He's just a wizard in a tower. And if you imagine the Middle-earth map in front of you, that's a strategically important position, because you have the Misty Mountains, which sort of come down north-south. The end of them is where Isengard is. Then you get the river Isen, and then below that you have the White Mountains starting, which sort of head roughly west-east. The other end of those, that's where we get Minas Tirith. But between the two mountain ranges, there's this gap called the Gap of Rohan. And that is the weak point on the western side of Rohan. And that's what Saruman said that he would protect. So it seemed like a reasonable deal for the Rohirrim, who had long ago abandoned looking after it. So he set himself up there and started using the Orthanc stone to be seeing what's going on and investigating things. And eventually, through that, Sauron, unbeknownst to everyone, had access to a Seeing Stone too, and he made contact with Saruman, and this is what starts to precipitate the even greater fall. But if we fast forward a little bit to the time of The Hobbit, or a bit before the time of The Hobbit, in fact, Gandalf realizes that the necromancer in Dol Guldur is Sauron, and he urges the White Council to attack. Let's go now. There's no need to kind of waste time. We know where he is. We're pretty strong. He's pretty weak. We can do this. Saruman, however, as the head of the White Council, says no. Now, this will have felt quite a suspicious thing to the rest of the White Council, and it does make us wonder why he didn't do that. He is, by this point, wanting the ring for himself. His research has turned from being something academic. He wants to learn about rings of power and the lore and how this all works, and has moved to he wants to have a ring of power himself. He does incidentally make himself a ring of power, but we don't know the powers of that. It probably wasn't anywhere near as powerful as the other rings of power. But he was starting down that path, and he wanted the One Ring. He had got people out searching for it. And his thinking was, having researched this, is that Sauron being nearby-ish, Dol Guldur, very close to the Gladden Fields where it was last seen, him being nearby-ish would encourage the ring to reveal itself. The nature of this relationship is never fully mapped out by Tolkien, but the ring could sense Sauron. It always wanted to get back towards Sauron, and he thought, if Sauron's there, then if I'm keeping an eye on this whole area, I will be able to see the ring revealing itself in some way. But that didn't really work. It didn't really work because Gollum had got the ring and hidden under the Misty Mountains and wasn't going anywhere with it. And eventually Saruman had to admit defeat and say, okay, we'll just get rid of Sauron. Sauron also is growing in strength again, and Saruman is now starting to wonder whether maybe it would be better just push him away. So he joins with the White Council, and they all charge into Dol Guldur and push Sauron out. Now, Sauron disappears down. That's what happens in that break in The Hobbit, when Gandalf disappears off to do some important work. He's there with Saruman and the rest of the White Council. Sauron heads off down to Mordor, announces himself to the world sometime later. Right. Saruman is continuing his fall, and he starts stepping up his own preparations. He starts building an army. He starts sending out spies. He starts he thinks that he's manipulating Sauron by making Sauron believe that he's a loyal servant. He's not. The idea is that he was using Sauron and would try to get the ring before Sauron did. If that failed, then yeah, he would be Sauron's lieutenant. He knew where the power lay, but he was going to try and beat him to it. And then he also started trying to weaken Rohan, which is obviously the big military power on his doorstep. He gathered the Dunlendings as allies, built his army. Through all this time, and we will come back to this in a little bit, he also had what Tolkien, whenever he's talking about it, he always sees this as sort of almost like a whimsical subplot. That Saruman was very suspicious of Gandalf and thought Gandalf must know more. Gandalf must have plans. He must know more than he's revealing, which in the end Gandalf probably did. But he didn't trust him to start with. And he also, because he tried to treat it, he was very jealous of him. He didn't want Gandalf ever to get what he would view as being some kind of upper hand over him. And he was like, he saw Gandalf smoking pipeweed and clearly enjoying it. And he thought Gandalf was just taunting him with it in some way. So, having seen Gandalf is starting to get very focused in on the Shire, he goes to investigate the Shire. And he wanders around there a huge amount and learns about the Shire, but there's not much to learn. To start with, when he was there, the ring wasn't there at all. Gandalf just liked the Shire. And during this time, Saruman starts smoking pipeweed and really enjoys it, but does not want to admit this to Gandalf. He's there being very proud. He says, teased him about it before, being rather cruel about it, and so he didn't want Gandalf knowing that he now smokes pipeweed. So he sort of backs off from the Shire a bit because he's starting to get a bit concerned that the hobbits they've spotted him. He can't be completely inconspicuous going through there. Some people have seen him, and so he thinks he doesn't want Gandalf knowing he's there. So he takes a step back, but he sets up this import or export business from the Shire to him of pipeweed, which is how we get those barrels of pipeweed in the Isengard storehouse. And the people who are doing this, he keeps as this kind of like spy network around the area. He's sure something's going on, but he doesn't want to personally go there. But he's just keeping half an eye on. We'll come back to that link later. Because then Gandalf sort of falls into his lap, really. Saruman kind of summons him. He can sense things are going on. He kind of summons him via Radagast. Gandalf turns up, and Gandalf sort of admits a bit more where the ring is, what's going on, at which point Saruman says, right, that's it. This is my pitch. He's not making a good faith offer, but he pitches to Gandalf, come on my side. The two of us, we could take on Saruman. So we could take on Sauron. And if that doesn't work, then we can work for Sauron. Sauron's got the power. If he gets the ring, then that's where the power's going to be. Let's just choose the right side now. Gandalf obviously says no. Saruman captures him, but Gandalf escapes. 2 days later, the Witch King and Nazgul turn up, sent there by Sauron to say, we think you must know something. What's going on with the Shire? I've heard the word Shire and Baggins. Tell us what you know. And Saruman's like, I know nothing. Do you know who does know though? Gandalf. And he escaped here just 2 days ago. He must be somewhere around Rohan. Go find Gandalf. So the Witch King heads off. Doesn't find Gandalf. Does find Grima. And Grima, basically, understandably, it's just him against the Nazgul. He just tells everything he knows. And he says, yeah, Saruman knows all about the Shire. The Shire's up that direction. You should go that way. So at this point, the Nazgul and then obviously later Sauron know that Saruman is a traitor to them. And Gandalf has escaped knowing that Saruman is a traitor to them. He's been playing both sides, but now both sides know it. So what does he do? Well, he might as well go on the offensive. So he does. We get, and I did my War of the Ring playlist, if you're interested, breaking down the war. But the starting point for this, there was a bit of a scuffle down on Osgiliath earlier, but the starting point of the war in this part of the world was the battle for the Fords of Isen. He rallies his troops and takes on some Rohirrim at the Fords of Isen over 2 battles, and he wins. It's a surgical strike intended to kill Thedred, the king's son, and also to try and weaken the Rohirrim as much as possible. He captures the Fords of Isen, strategically important, but a lot of the Rohirrim manage to escape and regroup, and then he pushes on into Rohan. Now, he could have decided, I'll just go straight for the capital, the Edoras. But instead, he thinks, I'll just follow these guys and I will take out their biggest fortress. So he goes to what we know as Helm's Deep. And we obviously know what happens in the battle there. Eventually, his forces get destroyed. Gandalf and the other leaders all head up to Orthanc, and Saruman's there. Basically, he's lost his power base. The army he had has gone. Grima even throws out the Orthanc stone, the Palantir. So he's got nothing. Gandalf casts him from the Order, and then commits Treebeard, the Ents obviously have destroyed Isengard, to be guarding Saruman. At which point, the whole plot moves on, and we don't really think about Saruman all that much for the rest of it, because there's bigger stuff happening down in Minas Tirith and Mordor and places like that. But he's captured there, and eventually Treebeard releases him. Why does Treebeard release him? Well, Treebeard loves freedom. He hates things being confined. He is like the wild growth of trees. That's what he's all about. And Saruman being locked up just didn't kind of work for him. He was happy to do it as a favor for a while, but in the long term, Saruman's lost most of his powers. What harm can he do? He just let him go. At which point we come back to the Shire plot. Because if you'll remember the import-export business he set up with Pipeweed, his people were already up there around that area. I did a video on this a week or 2 ago, the Sackville-Baggins coup. This is a thing that we often completely overlook because the action is elsewhere. Once Frodo and co had left the Shire, the Sackville-Baggins family, Lotho Sackville-Baggins in particular, they launch a coup. They take over the Shire. He sets himself up basically as this autocratic leader, and throwing people in jail, refusing to allow mass gatherings of people. If anyone opposes, they get beaten. This is hard stuff. And Lotho manages this, firstly, by the influx of money he's had from this export business, which sounds like, oh, he just sold a few barrels of pipeweed. The Shire never sold anything outside of the Shire, really, at all. Maybe a tiny bit to Bree, but that's about it. And so this foreign money coming in made the Sackville-Bagginses, who were already very rich, made them hugely rich. And they could then buy up bits of the Shire, like the Old Mill, for example, like Bag End. And they took over and knocked down the old mill and built up a new one, and started exporting more things like foodstuffs, gaining even more money. But that obviously, it was coming up to winter, and some of the hobbits were starting to go, we've not got food. We're quite self-sufficient here in the Shire, and now you're selling some of that we need to other people. So it's Lotho took over, with the ruffians supporting his reign. Saruman, however, is aware of this, and he knows the Shire very well, and he heads up to the Shire because he visited there in secret for so long. He heads up to the Shire and just takes over. He kicks out Charky. He kicks out Lotho, uses the name Sharky, which is a name that was used for him in Isengard by the orcs and others, and just rules himself for some time before the hobbits come back. And we get the scouring of the Shire, and eventually we have this final showdown with Saruman. Sharky is revealed to be Saruman. Grima is there, and Saruman gets kicked out. They decide they're not going to kill him, but he gets kicked out, and they're heading off, and he just gives Grima this one last kick, quite literally, and Grima turns on him and just stabs him in the back. And then I've got the quote here. This is what happens. To the dismay of those who stood by, about the body of Saruman a grey mist gathered, and rising slowly to a great height, like smoke from a fire, as a pale sorry for clicking my finger. Fun fact: when I'm recording my normal videos, if I make a mistake, I click my fingers, and so naturally, and then redo it so I can see it when I'm going through the edit later. Complete digression. I apologise. Which means that automatically, if I make a mistake when I'm reading something out here, I click my fingers. So that's what that was about. Apologies. Anyway. About the body of Saruman a grey mist gathered, and rising slowly to a great height like smoke from a fire, as a pale shrouded figure, it loomed over the hill. For a moment it wavered, looking to the west. But out of the west came a cold wind, and it bent away, and with a sigh dissolved into nothing. Frodo looked down at the body with pity and horror, for as he looked it seemed that long years of death were suddenly revealed in it, and it shrank, and the shriveled face became rags of skin upon a hideous skull. Lifting up the skirt of the dirty cloak that sprawled beside it, he covered it over and turned away. And that is the last of Saruman. The cloud is showing that he's a spiritual being. We said this right at the very beginning. He's not just a human. He is immortal, an immortal spiritual being. And that was his spirit, just being freed from this body that he had. Why didn't he shapeshift? Just as an aside, because those 5 Istari, when they came to Middle-earth, they were all charged to take on the forms of, and kind of locked into the forms of old men, so that they would not be seen to be leading as sort of these kind of powerful younger figures, but as senior advisors. So he couldn't shapeshift, but his spirit was still there. And that, however, got blown away by a wind out of the west. So the clear implication here is this is Manwë, just blowing him away. And you actually see when Sauron's end comes with the destruction of the ring, a similar kind of thing happens. This kind of big clouded form grows before a wind blows that away too. So that is Saruman as a sort of an overall history. He is, as a technicality, we should probably say, therefore, it was the same with Sauron, but as a technicality, he isn't dead. He's an immortal spiritual being. It's just that he can no longer take on a physical form in Middle-earth. Okay, let's go to some questions from my patrons. Lord Patch, first of all, saying, I hope all is well. I was hoping you can shed some light on the relative power levels of the Istari. Do you think their levels of power or colours were set by the Valar, or was it more self-deterministic? Thanks to the moderators for doing great work. Yes, I should say right away that this is as live. I'm not doing this live, but the moderators will be there. I'm doing this as a premiere, which means that the chat is there. If you are there in the chat, please just send a little bit of love to the moderators. They do a fantastic job. And while I'm thinking about thanking people, patrons, thank you. I hugely appreciate what support you give me. I cannot do this without your support. So thank you so much. So, What about their levels of power? Were they set by the Valar? Well, no. They were innate powers. The power levels they had were innate. They were created by Eru. So the Valar were created before Arda itself was created by Eru. So their innate power levels stem from that. The order that they gave, that was given to them when they got sent over as the Astari, as we see it, it feels a little bit changeable, in as much as they have to kind of assert things. It's not obvious. It's not they go straight away and say everybody knows this is the order of them. Saruman assumes that he's going to be first, but then he's a bit grumpy when there's the clarification Gandalf is not the third, and the implication is maybe Gandalf should be higher up. He thinks he knows where they should be. Saruman's estimation seems to be on sort of basic power level, and we've got something about that here from Tolkien. This is in there's a chapter in Unfinished Tales about the Astari, which is a collection of all Christopher Tolkien pulled together, all of the different bits of writing that Tolkien, his father, did about the Astari. And it says this: we must assume that they, the Astari, were all Maiar, that is, persons of the angelic order, though not necessarily of the same rank. The Maiar were spirits, but capable of self-incarnation, and could take humane, especially elvish, forms. Saruman is said, e.g. by Gandalf himself, to have been the chief of the Astari, that is, higher in Valinorian stature than the others. Gandalf was evidently the next in order. Radagast is presented as a person of much less power and wisdom. Of the other two, nothing is said in published work, save for a couple of mentions. And then we're told that of the five, each had different powers and inclinations and were chosen by the Valar with this in mind. So the Valar knew that they had their different strengths and weaknesses. And so obviously, we know what Radagast's are. He's good with the animals. He's good at blending in with nature, that kind of thing. That's there to be balancing. Saruman's more kind of crafty, more kind of lore-focused work. Gandalf has got the mercy. He's got the intuitiveness. He's got the care, as well as great power and wisdom as well. The Blue Wizards we know less about, but it appears that their innate powers come from their own creation, but they were chosen as a group by the Valar in order to have matching skill sets. And the colours, Tolkien doesn't really go into it. It has to be said. It's just a thing. So white definitely appears to be, this is the head, but the extent to which this was an order that was there, that you would already be white, and then the grey shows your next powerful, whatever. That bit we simply do not know. All we know, obviously, is that when Gandalf comes back, he then is Gandalf the White. But it's not just like, I've got a promotion, I am now Gandalf the White. He actually says, I am Saruman, or Saruman as he should or could have been. Question from Stephen. As we know, Saruman began spying on the Shire for some time prior to the events of Lord of the Rings. Was he aware of Bilbo's birthday party and his vanishing trick? And if so, how did he interpret it? Did he suspect that it might have been the One Ring? And if so, what did he think had happened to it? Well, this is what we read in Unfinished Tales again. Seeing then that Gandalf thought the Shire worth visiting, Saruman himself visited it, but disguised and in the utmost secrecy, until he had explored and noted all its ways and lands, and thought then he had learned all that there was to know of it. And even when it seemed to him no longer wise nor profitable to go thither, he still had spies and servants that went in or kept an eye upon its borders, for he was still suspicious. So what we have here with Saruman in the Shire is that after spending a long time looking everywhere, which is when the ring wasn't really there, and finding not much, he then took a step back. We've already talked about the pipeweed plot, as it were, but he took a step back and left it to other people to keep an eye on things. So he probably was aware of Bilbo's party. He probably had heard that, and he will have been aware of Gandalf's friendship with Bilbo, obviously. But Whether he got the exact story about the disappearance, we don't know. He certainly personally wasn't there. And following that time, yes, Gandalf does come back a bit, but Gandalf actually leaves the Shire. Gandalf then heads off when he starts getting suspicious about what happens with the ring. Gandalf then heads off and goes to Minas Tirith, goes hunting for Gollum, that kind of thing. So, as far as Saruman is concerned, if anything, Gandalf, which is the reason why he is intrigued by what's going on in the Shire, because Gandalf is interested in the Shire. Gandalf was paying less interest in what was going on in the Shire, so he probably should have been less bothered about it himself. Added to which, his attention had now started to shift more towards Sauron, more towards building his own army up, and more towards what's going on in Rohan. So, was he aware? Perhaps, but he almost certainly wasn't aware of the significance of it. Katrina V saying, "Hi, Robert. Hi there. I have two questions on Saruman. My reading of the book is that, unlike in the movie, Saruman did not cause the storm and avalanche on Carantras. However, even if he didn't, could he have? Would a wizard's powers have extended to weather modification or control?" Um, well, we don't see. I mean, you're right. And in the films, obviously, Saruman is the one who's there. It's great visuals, calling forth all of the storms. In the books, that's not the case. There are hints, maybe this is Sauron, but as much as anything else, they kind of anthropomorphize the mountain itself. Radras is against us, is angry, and that's the kind of image we get. They don't ever sort of definitely come down and say, this is Sauron trying to stop us crossing. It's possible. Now, could a magician, a Maya, do that kind of thing? Well, yeah. We certainly see Sauron down manipulating the weather to a certain degree near Mordor. He pours forth darkness and clouds. So we have the dawnless day down that happens just by the siege of Minas Tirith. He pours forth the dawnless day, so it's dark for an entire day. That is definitely within his powers. Is it therefore potentially theoretically within the powers of someone like Saruman? Yes. The thing, as we keep on going back to, about the magic system in Tolkien's world is that it is a soft magic system. Tolkien kept it deliberately unclear. He didn't want to write out clear rules of what one thing is possible, what another thing is possible. Take Gandalf, for example. He is clearly a very powerful magician, and he clearly has, because of his ring of power, a great affinity with fire-type magic. Fireworks, setting little pine cones on fire, creating fire when all of the wood is very wet, that kind of thing. He can do magical stuff with fire very easily, but he also knows various other spells to do with unlocking and locking doors, for example. He talks about that a bit. We see lots of magic, but we don't ever get a clear and concise magic system. Is the magic required for creating a storm on a mountain the kind of thing we might expect someone like Saruman to be able to do? Yes. Did he do that? No. I think one thing which often goes a little bit unsaid here is the simple fact that the Fellowship were trying to cross a very high snow-covered mountain range in January. This we shouldn't necessarily be looking for some other intervention here. This was a pretty treacherous route already. This is a mountain range which is known for being really hard to cross over, and they're trying to do it in the toughest time of the year. So I think instinctively we shouldn't be necessarily looking for what is the one thing that, or the one person who is here trying to oppose them. This is nature, just being normal. Your second question is, why do you think Saruman wanted to be called Sharky while in the Shire? Was he trying to hide his identity? I know he says the people of Isengard used to call him that, but it seems like such a cartoonish name for him to willingly take on. Um, well, his exact words, which you're, I think, clearly aware of, was, "So you've heard the name, have you?" This is when Frodo says, "Sharky, Saruman." He says, "So you've heard the name, have you? All my people used to call me that in Isengard, I believe. A sign of affection, possibly." So he clearly thinks this is like a thing that people call him because they like him, because they respect him. It probably isn't. If you actually look at the kind of the derivations of that, the hints are this is an orcish name for him, which has just got adapted by the humans who were in his service. So it probably isn't that. But perhaps he sees that there is a part of him which actually wants to believe that people there like him. They respect him. His people follow him for who he is, not because he's just very powerful. So, um, in a kind of like practical sense, I suspect what happened is that he sort of said, "I'm coming," or just arrived, and then the ruffians there said, "Oh, Sharky's here," because that's what they called him. And rather than saying, "No, don't call me Sharky, call me Saruman," he allowed it because that was just what people were going out and saying. Why did he allow it? Well, yes, he probably was trying to keep a relatively low profile. The the fact is that he'd had his power stripped from him, and he still had the power of his voice, but that wasn't as strong and powerful a thing as you might expect it to be. He couldn't um, turn when he meets the um, Gandalf and co. He couldn't turn any of them against him. Yes, Gandalf had to warn them. Sort of onto his side, Gandalf had to warn them, be aware of his words and his voice. But in particular, he knew that Gandalf was still opposition and more powerful than him now. Did he want to advertise his presence there in a place that he knows that Gandalf knows and likes? No, I don't think so. So was he happy to buy himself a little bit of extra cover by having this name Sharky? Yeah, I think he's probably all right with that. As you say, it is, I mean, cartoonish, perhaps, but it's like that's a name that is used for him, and why try and create a new one? Dana the Defiant saying, "Hi, Robert. Can you talk about the aspect of Saruman's having a mind of metal and wheels?" Yes, so this is a quote from Treebeard saying, and he says, "I think that I now understand what Saruman, is up to. He is plotting to become a power. He has a mind of metal and wheels, and he does not care for growing things, except as far as they serve him except as far as they serve him for the moment. And now it is clear that he is a black traitor." So this is a Treebeard thing. This is something that Treebeard says about him as an insult. He has a mind of metal and gears. It's also probably something Tolkien would have thought was quite an insult. It's sort of saying that you're not a human. You're not part of nature. You're like a machine in your head, in your thoughts. That's not just a thing that you don't just like crafting stuff. You yourself are now like a machine. So this is an insult. We know that Tolkien was very pro-nature and very anti-industrialization. He wasn't a big fan of it. So that to him is the kind of thing you might say, in particular, a character like Treebeard, who embodies the freedom and bounteousness of nature. That is a huge insult. So yeah, it's also, if you go back in time, um, perhaps a hint as to why Radagast was sent as part of the Astari. Saruman was chosen, and then Yavanna intervened and said, "I'd like Radagast to go." Well, why is this important? Well, Radagast loves nature, and Yavanna has a history of care. She is the Valar for nature, basically. And she has a history of trying to balance out anything that she thinks is going to be um, imposing its will upon nature. When the dwarves are created by her husband Aula, secretly, she then begs a boon, basically, from Erub, from Manwë, to say, we need some protections. The dwarves are just going to be cutting down trees left, right, and centre. As it turns out, I suspect that the elves and humans probably chopped down more trees than the dwarves did, but this was the concern. They'll be chopping down trees. We need some protection from the trees, and that's where the Ents came from in the first place. So she's got this history of intervening to try and protect nature. And so when Saruman is chosen, she needs to balance that with someone who is going to protect nature, hence pushing forward Radagast. And as we saw earlier, one of the things that the Valar were very keen to be doing was to be creating this kind of balance of skills and traits amongst the five Istari that they did, which is where Radagast comes in. So the clear implication of all of that is that Saruman's mind of metal and gears it was there before. Those with insight could already see he wasn't just somebody who liked crafting, making beautiful things. He actually was this kind of proto-industrialist at heart, and so there should be protections from him. Stephen, did Saruman have any dealings with the dwarves? I'm not aware of any, which seems strange when you consider the connection that they share with Aula the Smith. They could have had interests in common and worked to their mutual benefit, like with Celebrimbor. It is particularly odd because some of the refugees from the Lonely Mountain apparently settled for a time in Dunland near Isengard. Maybe they had dealings that were not important to events, but if so, it's a pity they were not included to add a bit more to the story. So, you're right. We don't have any specific dealings here between Saruman and the dwarves. And yes, on one level, they do seem to share quite a lot in common. They love crafting things. So, would they therefore get on? Maybe is probably the answer. But there is no direct connection. Yes, there's the link with Aula, but I think we need to be clear that whereas Saruman he worked with Aula. He was there alongside him. He spent time there in his inner circle. The dwarves were not. They were created by Aula. The breath was blown into them by Iluvatar, but Aula did the crafting. And then they got put down in Middle-earth. And then they kind of worship Aula, but not... they didn't know him. He wasn't like somebody that they'd worked with. They just got their kind of life essence from him. So there is a link, but it's not a link in terms of they've been working together in the past, the dwarves in some way. Might Saruman have had contact with dwarves? I think it's very probable that he did at some point. He spent a long time in the east. 4 of the 7 tribes of the dwarves are in the east. We don't know what Saruman was doing there for however long, 1,500 years or whatever it was. He was off in the east. We've no idea. There's a fair chance he might have run into some dwarves there. As you say, there were some dwarves who pitched up for a little while at least in Dunland. Might he have had some connection there? It's possible. We just don't read about this all that much. So I don't think we can say that he didn't have any dealings with dwarves. But at the same time, we don't have evidence that he did. There is one intriguing interaction, though. There's one of those ones where we can read a lot into it if we want to. But after Saruman's defeat, and he's there in Orthanc, and then Gandalf brings the guys there to go and see him. Saruman turns specifically and looks to Gimli, and he says, "I do not speak to you yet, Gimli, Gloin's son. Far away is your home, and small concern of yours are the troubles of this land. But it was not by design of your own that you became embroiled in them, and so I will not blame such part as you have played. A valiant one, I doubt not. Which is just like a little interesting side. Now, Saruman is trying to win them over with his honeyed words here, clearly, but he knows who Gimli is, and he is basically saying, I don't hold you responsible for what it is. I know where you've come from. I know various things about you. And I think that I'm pretty sure, knowing dwarves, that your contribution thus far will have been valiant. All of which seems to imply that his knowledge and understanding of dwarves, and perhaps even admiration for dwarves, is not just a thing he's read about in books. That does seem to imply a sort of a greater degree of knowledge and understanding of them. Now, again, that doesn't mean that he's worked alongside dwarves at all in the past, but it's another hint in that direction. Stephen saying, hi, Robert. A lot of jokes have been made about how Saruman's name sounds so similar to Sauron. And I know it. The amount of times I've tripped over those two names in recording videos is quite embarrassing. Do you know how Tolkien came up with his name and why he chose it? Was he ever concerned about the similarity? On the last part, as far as we're aware, no. He was never concerned about the similarity. He never said it in any way, shape, or form. There are plenty in his world. There are plenty of characters with names that are quite similar, and it didn't seem to really bother him. When you go back to the elves' names, they are very similar. Back in the Silmarillion, if you've read the Silmarillion, you will know what I mean. So, at a high conceptual level, he didn't think this was an issue. He didn't think people would get confused between the two. Digging down another level, he was obviously big about words and big about pronunciation. But one of the things I find fascinating is that when we have audio recordings of him, not huge amounts, but a big enough sample, that we've got several times when he pronounces the word Sauron. And he pronounces it, to my ear at least, in at least two different ways. Once Sauron, once Sauron. And Saruman, also, it's more Saruman. So there's a more of a fluidity and a difference between the pronunciations that he himself came up with that perhaps we think. So first point, don't necessarily say, I know everyone gets, because Tolkien does come up with these very clear pronunciation guides. You can get very focused on this has to be pronounced in this particular way. Tolkien himself changed how he said somebody as central to his plot as Sauron. The style guides there, you will find it as in sow, as in the English word sour milk, Sauron. But then when he pronounces it, at least once I've heard him say Sauron, but then on other occasions, Sauron. It doesn't help that he mumbles quite a lot as a speaker. He's a great writer. As a speaker, not so much. Listen to anecdotes about what he was like as a lecturer at Oxford. The general feeling was that he would stand there at the front with his pipe in his mouth, wandering around the stage, sort of mumbling to himself, and people caught maybe half a word here or there. He wasn't a great speaker, but he was a fantastic writer, obviously. Don't get me wrong, by the way. If you can hear him do a recording when there are some times that he read some bits out from the Lord of the Rings. Fantastic. Do go and check them out. But getting back to the Saruman thing, yes, they look similar. My guess is that this is deliberate on his part. He will obviously have spotted it, and I suspect he's only human. At some point, he may well have, mixed it up himself. So he will have been aware of the similarity. My personal view is that it was placed there to show they're growing together, the similarity that is starting to emerge, because those are not their names. their original names. And we often just think about The Lord of the Rings as the main event. Yes, it is. It was the big standout book that got produced. But from Tolkien's mind, there was this decades of world building and creation that led up to this. And The Lord of the Rings was just a story which sort of branched out off of it. So he doesn't look at Sauron and think that that person's name through their life is Sauron or Saruman, that person's name. He will think this is Myron. Myron is what Sauron was called originally. That was his first name. Myron means admired one, and then Sauron means abhorred one. And this is what the elves called him when he went to evil, when he turned sides. They changed it from admired one to abhorred one. Saruman kept the same kind of root meaning, the man of skill, but Karumo was his first name, is the name that he had when he was over in the Undying Lands, and then Saruman is sort of the translation that the men of the West gave him. So for Tolkien, those weren't their actual fundamental names. They started in different places and then they came together. And there is therefore no linguistic root between the two. There is just a symbolic coming together of two names and characters. James Perkins, hello, Robert. I was wondering if you could speak a bit to the unique skill that Saruman has, as opposed to all of the other Maiar that we encounter in the story, his voice. What is it that gives him this potent skill? Are there other Maiar with similar unique talents? Radagast and his aptitude for changes of colour and hue come to mind. Yes, this is natural. This is not a power that was given to him by the Valar. This is something that he had before. We witness it in one of the descriptions of when they arrive. He is described as having, I can't remember exactly what it was. This isn't the word. A charismatic voice, something along those lines. That's the idea that he's got in a description of when he arrives into Middle Earth. He has this already. And he still had it when Gandalf threw him from the Order. So this isn't anything to do with the creation of that Order. It's not an Istari thing. It's not a special talent given to him for being there in Middle-earth. This was just something that who he is. And I think that the example you pick up on is a really good one. Radagast is particularly skilled in hues and colours, which sounds like an incredibly vague kind of thing. But it's basically disguise. He can fit in places and things like that. That's just a natural part of who he is, it would appear. Saruman, a natural part of who he is this ability with his voice. It's not so much like a magic. There certainly is magic, obviously, again, soft magic system. There is sort of magic in there, but this is more of like just an ability that a natural innate ability that he has to be persuasive with his voice. Ninja Robbo. Hi, Robert. I hope you're well. I am, thank you. I have a couple of Saruman questions. If I remember rightly, the Nazgul go to Isengard a couple of times in the Fellowship. What do you think that the interaction was like? Which side feared the other more? In such a fantastic, and secondly, in such a fantastically cast film or set of films, do you think Christopher Lee as Saruman was the best? Having arguably the most recognizable and commanding voiced actor of the century, playing a character whose power resides in their voice is utterly lore-tastic. He looked great too. Well, I'll pick up on the second point first about the casting, and yes, clearly excellent casting. He wanted to be Gandalf, actually, and was quite annoyed when he didn't get it. Eventually he was happy, though, being Saruman, as long as he could be in the film. And if I had to sort of rank, yeah, he's top tier. Within, I don't think there was a bit of bad casting in the entire film or set of films, in my view. I personally think Sean Astin works perfectly. I mean, that's the job of a lifetime for him, acting job of a lifetime for him. Ian McKellen as well, Perfect. So there are so many that you just go. I mean, Viggo Mortensen, I get there's another. You can just it's just right. But yeah, Saruman. I think the thing with what Christopher Lee brought was this innate gravitas to it, which he had to have. Everywhere he went, this was about him. The whole thing was just his aura, as we would say these days. And I think, yeah, the voice was astonishing. So a great bit of casting. But what about then the Nazgul go to Isengard? Well, we get this. Which I think again is just from Unfinished Tales. I'll read it to you. This is the description of what happened. Then Saruman, already filled with wrath and fear by the escape of Gandalf, perceived the peril of standing between enemies, and known traitor to both. His dread was great, for his hope of deceiving Sauron, or at the least of receiving his favour in victory, was utterly lost. Now either he himself must gain the ring, or come to ruin and torment. But he was wary and cunning still, and he had ordered Isengard against such an evil chance. The circle of Isengard was too strong for even the Lord of Morgul and his company to assail without great force of war. Therefore, to his challenge and demands he received only the answer of the voice of Saruman, that spoke by some art as though it came from the gate itself. It is not a land that you look for, it said. I know what you seek, though you do not name it. I have it not, as surely its servants perceive without telling. For if I had it, then you would bow before me and call me lord. And if I knew where this thing was hid, I should not be here, but long gone before you to take it. There is one only whom I guess to have this knowledge, Mithrandir, enemy of Sauron. And since it is but 2 days since he departed from Isengard, seek him nearby. Such was still the power of the voice of Saruman that even the Lord of the Nazgul did not question what it said, whether it was false or short of the full truth. But straightway he rode from the gate and began to hunt for Gandalf in Rohan. That's what happened. Saruman was wary. He was scared of being seen as the traitor by both sides, by both Gandalf and the Wise and Sauron. And as a result, he thought, what I'm going to do is, when the Witch King's coming, I'm just not going to let him in. And so he didn't let him in. He kept the Lord of Morgul and his company outside the wall, and then just sort of projected his voice out. And he used his power. He has got a very powerful, almost magical voice. We'll come on to that in a moment. And he used this to convince them to look elsewhere. And he lied to them. That's the other key point here. He didn't want Sauron knowing that he had an idea about where the ring might be. He didn't want him knowing that he knew where the Shire was. So the power in his voice was such that the Witch King did indeed head out and do what he was told. But straight away after that, 2 days after that, they then ran into Grima, and Grima basically just spilled all the information. And Grima, who was at the time coming back from Edoras, he said, yeah, of course, Saruman knows where the Shire is. Saruman knows what's going on there. Don't listen to him. And he begged to have his life spared, and they did spare his life, figuring that he might cause more problems for Saruman in the long term, and indeed he did. So, who was more scared? Saruman was more scared of being caught as a liar by both sides. We're not told what the Witch King thought, but Saruman was wary of him. Okay, so next question from Rabbi Mitra saying, salutations, Robert and Dan the dog. Here's a question which ties in 2 videos you've made over the past year. Gandalf's forgotten mission in the First Age, and when did Saruman turn evil? The big lesson in the second video is that there is no fixed point where Saruman turned evil, but that it was rather a slow burn over the ages. But can we definitively say that during his First Age mission to protect the elves in Cuiviénen, Saruman was purely a Maiar who was not evil? Well, no, we can't. on a technical point, it wasn't the first age. This was even earlier than that. But he, as we've seen, all the way back when he was in the Undying Lands, he still had that kind of arrogance to him. He was still not perfect. And I think this is something that we do have to just sort of clarify, I think, to ourselves sometimes, which is we think of the Blessed Realm, we think of the Undying Lands as this kind of almost perfection, and the way they're presented a lot of the times in film and TV is almost this kind of heavenly realm. And so in our minds, we think this is perfect. There is no evil there. Nothing bad is there. But that's not what it's like. We know Sauron, for a very long time, stayed there as a Maya while he had already fallen and was spying for Morgoth. So he was there. Morgoth himself, for some time, was in the Undying Lands, pretending to have repented, but actually not really having done so. So there is the potential for fallen people and evil going on there. And Saruman was among that number. He was not evil from the beginning. Don't get me wrong. That process accelerated towards the end of his time in Middle-earth. But while he was in the Undying Lands, he was not perfect. He was on the side of the good guys, but he was not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, I think you only just need to see his reaction to Radagast being sent along with him. Incredibly disdainful, didn't want to go with him at all, thought it was beneath him. That is not a good attitude. So even during that time, he was not perfect, but he was one of the good guys. Then you've got a tinfoil theory. Around 2000 in the Third Age, Sauron fled Dol Guldur in front of Gandalf and went to the east, thus bringing about the Watchful Peace. Sauron even returned to Dol Guldur at exactly the exact same time as Saruman returned to the west to lead the White Council. I personally think that Sauron started his long manipulation game of Saruman during these intersecting 400 to 500 years in the east. This is why manipulating and controlling a powerful Maya like Saruman via the Orthanc Stone was so easy for Sauron years down the line. I'm not saying they communicated with each other whilst in the East, but rather that this was a one-directional manipulation game by Sauron on Saruman for 400 to 500 years. What do you think of my theory? Well, I mean, I like it. We don't have any evidence of this. Sauron returning at the end of the Watchful Peace, the establishment of the White Council, the finding by Smeagol of the One Ring, this all happened at about the same time, and there is clearly no coincidence about that. The ring was starting to move, and the Wise could feel it, and Sauron could feel it, and perhaps Saruman, in a way, could feel it. He had been, as we know, studying ring law, so perhaps he was more attuned to these kind of things than others were. But when Saruman and Sauron were both off in the east, might Sauron have started a kind of a subtle manipulation? It's possible, but I don't think it's necessary for our understanding of what happened. I don't think that we need that to have happened for Saruman's fall to have happened. In fact, I quite like this idea that a lot of his fall happens by this shift away from studying ring law to understand it, to wanting to possess a ring. And that is a very personal kind of shift in him, and he just gets tempted by it. And I quite like that as the kind of the precursor to, and then through the Palantiri, Sauron can start to influence him. So I like that. I have no problems with this idea that in the East that maybe Sauron was aware of Saruman. I suspect he probably was. And maybe he'd laid some of the groundwork, but we don't need that, and we don't have any specific evidence for it. But good tinfoil. Robin Thomas, here is my question. How did Saruman come to breed orcs in the first place? In the movie, it just comes from nowhere with an orc or goblin appearing by his side. Are there any previous hints in the books? Well, um, you're right to use the word breed, first of all, because in the films, it does sort of seem to imply that he just sort of like gave birth to them in this kind of, or made them in some weird fantasy laboratory or something like that. Now, orcs breed in the manner of humans and men, and Saruman did that. Now, sometime earlier, we have Sauron inventing the Uruk-hai. The Uruk-hai were basically upgraded orcs. I did a video, you asked actually about the difference between orcs and goblins. Basically, they're the same thing. Tolkien used goblins more in The Hobbit and orcs more in The Lord of the Rings. But I did a video on all of these things, which I will probably re-upload at some point. But Uruk-hai are upgraded orcs. They are orcs who are stronger and they are more intelligent. And also, crucially, they don't need to stay in the darkness. They're okay in the light, which gives a huge advantage if you're wanting to be invading Middle Earth. Because if you're invading Middle Earth with troops that can only do things half of the time, that's a massive disadvantage. So, having got these Uruk-hai, Saruman was wanting to build himself an army, and he built his army partly through alliances with the Dunlendings, but he also wanted to have his own army. Now, you can breed orcs if you want to. I suspect he's not too far from the Misty Mountains. There are some up there. I suspect what he did was he captured some orcs. Maybe Sauron half encouraged him, thinking that he was controlling Saruman more than he actually was, thinking this would be quite useful, having a second army somewhere over on the far side of Rohan. But then Saruman and Treebeard gets very angry about this, seems to start to try to experiment himself, to try to upgrade his orcs to make them into Uruk-hai by crossbreeding with humans in some way. That at least is what Treebeard's theory is, and it's probably right. So it doesn't seem that Sauron just sort of gave him a few orcs. He probably took a few orcs and then did his own experiments. This would have taken, I know in the films, it's almost as if they just suddenly appear. This would have taken years, decades even. He was building this up slowly over a long period of time. Katrina V. When Saruman studied Sauron and the lore of the rings for centuries, what exactly was he studying? Were there that many books on the subject? Was he interviewing people or gaining information some other way? So we're not told is the short answer. Research into ring lore. The only thing that we're really told about him doing is going to Minas Tirith, and there they had a great library, ancient texts. You see Gandalf there in the films, going through all of these ancient documents, and he stumbled across the one from Isildur where he gets the clues about the One Ring. Saruman presumably also went and studied those ancient documents and tried to understand what was going on there. But also, studying ring lore doesn't just mean reading books. He was a craftsman, remember. He started his life as a Maya in the Blessed Realm as a student of Aula. Aula was the great craftsman, and the Saruman, the name, means man of skill, man of craft. So almost certainly he would have been practicing. He would have been learning, and then he would have tried it out, and it's kind of like a practical experiment just to see what happened. So that's the kind of feel we get. I'm sure, yes, he talks to people. There will have been some people, Elrond, for example, Galadriel, who will have some information for him. But some of it will be study and some of it will be practical experimentation. Question R. Even when Saruman was still good, in inverted commas, he maintained a grudge against Gandalf out of jealousy. He was then ensnared by Sauron, not only because Sauron deceived him, but also because his own pride of his own pride and hunger for power. Understandably, Saruman became angry and bitter when he was robbed of his power, and Gandalf, of all people, was the one who sealed his downfall. After he fled from Orthanc, he made his way to the Shire to take revenge on the hobbits. This was surprising to me because the hobbits hadn't contributed that much to his downfall. My guess is that he actually wanted to hurt Gandalf, who loved the hobbits and the Shire. What do you think? Um, and then you sort of go on and say, here's what baffles me. When confronted by Frodo in the Shire, Saruman seems to have sunk even lower than his own ruffians, oddly arrogant and petty at the same time. What do you think about that? Was he always like that? Does this show the core of his personality once everything else has been stripped away, or the consequence of being corrupted by Sauron? Well, let's answer the first bit first. Why did Saruman go to the Shire? I think this is a really interesting psychological point. Uh, was this a matter of getting his own back on Gandalf? There may well have been an element of that. I think that's probably true. He knew that Gandalf loved the Shire, but also there's an element of where could he go? I mean, he certainly couldn't. If he was going to escape from Orthanc, which he did, he couldn't go up towards the Rivendell. He couldn't go all the way over towards the Grey Havens. He certainly couldn't head east through Rohan and towards Gondor. One place that he knew very well was the Shire, because he'd spent a long time searching it and traveling it all around. So it's a sensible place for him to go, added to which his spies will have told him what had been happening there. It had fallen. It was just ready for somebody to come in and take over. So I personally suspect this was just a matter of, this seems like the most sensible place for him. If this also hurt Gandalf, then so much better. I don't think that hobbits played huge amounts of part in his decision-making process there. As for the second part of the question about him being very petty, very cruel when he's there, yeah, he is. It's a very noticeable thing is that he at the very end, the last few lines he has, he's bullying Grima. He's deliberately saying things to try to hurt him and the hobbits, and it just feels as if that's all he's got left. It's just this very base, petty level of anger and hatred. Why is that? Um, I mean, I'm sure the psychologists among us will be able to give some good answers to this, but I think part of it is, yes, that it has to have always been a part of his personality. He always did, as you say, bear this grudge against Gandalf in a very kind of petty way. He hated Radagast, was very disdainful of him. Radagast the fool. So that was clearly a part of his character, a very arrogant part, a very nasty part of his character. But this is all, yes, since then he had fallen even more. And he had gone from great heights where he must have thought, I've got a chance of capturing the One Ring, and he did have a chance of capturing the One Ring. He thought he had, basically, when his orc warband captured a couple of hobbits when we were bringing them back to Isengard. He would have thought, this is it. This is my moment. I can take over everything now. But that wasn't to be. And in a matter of literally about a week, it doesn't take very long. The entire Saruman attacking Rohan and then being defeated utterly is literally just a matter of a few days. In a very short period of time, everything has come crashing down around him. And to make matters worse, he then loses his power. He loses his authority. Gandalf, this person who he disdains and really dislikes, he comes and is himself Gandalf the White. He's just taken over from Saruman. So, yes, what's left now is just this angerness and bitterness. It was always there, but events brought it to the fore. Andrew Biederman saying, "Hello, Robert. I was hoping that you could talk about Saruman the Ringmaker. He flashes a ring that he implies is a self-created ring of power, but we never see or hear about it again, as far as I can recall. Do we know anything about it, its creation, or if it actually held any power? It seems like it should be a major point, the first ring of power created since the mid-Second Age, but it doesn't seem to come up again at all." Yeah, so it's interesting. If you missed this, so when Gandalf arrives at Orthanc to see Saruman, then he sees that Saruman's got a ring on his finger. He just notices this. And then when Saruman is doing all of his extravagant boasting, Saruman of many colours, etc., then he calls himself Saruman Ringmaker. And the clear implication is that he has been making himself a ring of power. Now, you're right. Not much is made of this. If we sort of take a step back to what we were talking about just one moment ago, then I think that the clear point here is that this was a part of his studies, in that he would be doing some practical crafting to try, and he thought he'd learnt a little bit about how rings of power work. Here he's going to try a bit. He has and this turned from him studying in order to be able to understand so that he could oppose Sauron, to actually wanting to have a ring of power himself. Remember, there's one of his grudges against Gandalf is the fact that Gandalf was given by Círdan one of the rings of power and he wasn't, and he felt that he should have done. So there's a grievance there, a very long-standing grievance there. He created this, and my general feeling is that we don't hear much about it because it's not a mega powerful one. He has created a ring. It has got power. He has done it using some elements of what the ring magic is, but it's not that impressive yet. There were what Gandalf called essays in the craft, made by Sauron and Celebrimbor way back in the day in the Second Age. Sauron was there for 300 years crafting those rings of power with Celebrimbor. And Gandalf says, first of all, they made minor rings of power, essays in the craft. This is what, incidentally, he thinks initially the One Ring is. Bilbo's got it. Because he looks at it, it's okay, so this is a magical ring that can make you invisible. This is clearly powerful. It's not one of the three. It's not one of the 9. It's not one of the 7. What is it? It must be one of those essays in the craft. So, probably this is the equivalent. This is a magic ring. It is not a ring of power per se, to the same extent of the rings of power that we know about, but it is a magic ring of sorts. Perhaps he had reached a point where he had a ring and he had some other rings that he could try and distribute and see whether that could work. Maybe that was where he was going with it. But where his researches were heading, there is an interesting line in the foreword to, I think it's the 2nd edition of The Lord of the Rings, from Tolkien himself. It says that what if someone else or didn't get the ring, or things went slightly out of kilter. He says, Saruman, failing to get possession of the ring, would in the confusion and treacheries of the time have found in Mordor the missing links in his own researches into ring lore, and before long he would have made a great ring of his own with which to challenge the self-styled ruler of Middle-earth. So Saruman had some power and knowledge and understanding of how to make great rings of power, but not everything. There were some gaps in his knowledge that he could only learn by going to Mordor. And what we have there with his ring of power is his first iteration, his first test. He's clearly proud of it, but there's a long way to go. Okay, I've got a question. Actually, this is my last question, I think. This is Magma Frost 13 saying, "Hi, Robert. I don't have a question about Saruman, but I do have a question about Sauron, about some of the forms and identities he takes on. What does it mean for Sauron to be a vampire? What does it mean for him to be a werewolf? What does it mean for him to be a necromancer? And do any of these things exist in the Legendarium outside of Sauron taking these forms?" You go on to say Sauron was a prolific and capable shapeshifter, but I'm not sure how he can meaningfully be described as a werewolf. Given Bjorn existed, maybe it's plausible that actual werewolves also existed in Middle-earth, but was Sauron perhaps pretending to be one? And then vampires, much the same question as with werewolves. Vampires, quite notably, typically look much like humans, which Sauron often did anyway, and turn into bats, which again Sauron was perfectly capable of doing anyway. Did he turn into a pale-fanged human and start sucking people's blood? That doesn't sound right to me. What made someone in universe write that Sauron took the form of a vampire? What did that mean to them? So this was obviously, in case you don't know what we're talking about here, this is in the Silmarillion. Tolkien writes, when Luthien and Huan the Hound, the best boy in all of Middle-earth, arrive to try and free Beren and challenge Sauron. This is in the story of Beren and Luthien, obviously. Sauron comes to meet, he sends all of these other wolves and the like to try and take them out. Fails, he decides, I've got to do it myself. So he heads out and he tries various different forms, fighting against Huan in particular, also Luthien, who is very powerful, by the way. And there's a bit where he shifts a lot of times. He shifts into a werewolf. He shifts into a vampire. And this kind of confuses some people, I understand. Does he actually become a vampire? Does he actually become a werewolf? The phrase we're told to describe the vampire thing is a dark cloud-like entity with wings. So I think the answer here is Tolkien is clearly using very kind of dark imagery for him. And Sauron as a Maya can take on other physical forms, and so he took on the forms of a werewolf and a vampire, and not just the kind of like the modern Nosferatu kind of idea of a vampire, but a lot darker kind of idea. This childlike entity with wings. That's the kind of idea of the vampire that we've got going on here. This is more kind of colloquial. He did not take on the nature of those things. He took on the physical appearance of them, which allowed him to use certain of their characteristics, if that makes sense. So when for example, when he became Anatar and took on this fair-like hue, probably looked a bit like an elf, that didn't mean he became an elf, but he could do the kinds of things that human shape could do. And when he takes on the shape of a bat, he can fly and all these other things. So if he's taking on the shape of these fantastical creatures, he can adopt some of the things that they can do without him actually becoming them. You also asked about the necromancer. That's the name that he has for much of the Third Age when he's recovering in Dol Guldur. Now, it's not 100% clear whether he decided on that name or whether other people called him that name, but he clearly was happy for this not to be thought of, this is Sauron, but here's this necromancer person, which allowed him, I think, to be called the necromancer. I think it allowed the idea that he could live for a very long time, because necromancers potentially could. Are there necromancers in Middle-earth? If you're talking about somebody who deals with death magic, then yes, the Witch King is a classic example. He sent the Barrow-wights, and we see them much, much later in The Lord of the Rings attacking the hobbits. But he originally sent the Barrow-wights. That is dealing with the magic of the undead, and he is the Witch King of Angmar. You could argue that Sauron himself did very similar kind of necromantic magic, in that the ring wraiths are wraiths. Their corporeal forms have gone, but they themselves are kept to the corporeal realm. That is a form of necromancy. And the way I kind of have tended to understand this is that we have the reports coming out from Dol Guldur, people saying they can see wraiths. Maybe it's the ring wraiths. Gandalf initially thought that this was one of the ring wraiths, perhaps the Witch King taking up residence there. So that's why they were sort of that the rumors would have started spreading. This is a necromancer. There are undead wraith-like creatures hanging around there, and he allowed the name to stick because it also is quite scary. So people will not wish to investigate, except obviously Gandalf. Okay, and with that, I think I have sort of come to an end. I've actually stitched this live stream together. I had to break off a couple of times, so I hope that the stitches have been relatively seamless as we've been going through. But thank you so much for all of the questions. It's been fantastic, sort of working our way through this. I think he's a fascinating character. Tolkien did not create two-dimensional bad guy characters. Sauron often talk about how he's not a two-dimensional bad guy character. Saruman is not either. Saruman is fully realized as a character who fell, who started off, if not good, then he certainly descended towards evil from the place that he started at. And the causes of that we can point out. Some of them are external, but some of them are just facets of his personality. And Tolkien's almost, if he doesn't do morals, but if he were to point out something from Saruman that he emphasizes that I don't think I've really emphasized here, is the fact that if you study dark things, evil things for a long time, that will start to take you over. And it was the study that was the thing that took him all the way down there. Once he was there, that's when the temptation could start. That's when Sauron could start to influence him and influence his thinking. And he could think to himself, why not? I can do this myself. I'm not just studying it theoretically. I can do this. So I will be back next week with hopefully I'll do a live. I haven't decided yet what it's going to be on, but it'll be on at the same sort of time. If you are watching this back up a little bit later on YouTube, then appearing somewhere around here is going to be a link to other live streams that I've done. Appearing somewhere around here is a link to my Patreon page. Patrons, thank you so much. If you would like to support this channel, that is the best way to do it by far. So thank you all. Take care, and I will see you again next week.